Allegations of racial discrimination have again flared up against Chinese nationals working in African countries after a video showing a Chinese man whipping African workers with a stick went viral on the internet. Only just weeks ago, a disturbing footage of African employees being mercilessly assaulted by an Asian man rippled across the globe. The purported video, shared by journalist Dom Lucre, shows the Chinese employer yelling at the African workers and beating them with a whip and kicking them as they cover their heads to avoid any serious injury. This disturbing footage, between the time of its publication being the 2nd of May, 2024 and now, has garnered over 18 million views in a very short span of time. That would mean that this had caused quite a great stir, sparking outrage on social media, promoting a torrent of replies from a whole lot of persons who were aghast and disturbed after watching the cruel treatment of the African employees in question. Most have likened the glaring situation perceived from the footage, plus the cruel act of the Chinese man toward his black subordinates, as that of slavery. Many, in fact, are being reminded of the Atlantic slave trade saga by the inciting video. Viewers, however, are being triggered to discuss how it appears the Chinese are far more racist than the Americans.
Everyone rails against America while completely ignoring the human rights abuses going on all over the world.
Slavery still exists. The West makes a massive fuss about slavery that happened 200 years ago in America. They don't talk about the slavery taking place all over the world right now.
America isn't the only country that has racism. What's scarier to think about is that we have Chinese nationalists crossing our border. They could be just like this guy.
I keep telling people they haven't seen what racism is until they go to Eastern Europe or Asia. The USA is so tame in comparison.
Every race has owned slaves, and every race has evil people among them. It's time for all the good people, who make up the majority in each race, to stand together against those in all races who are evil.
The internet was set aflame by this horrendous outbreak. This is not the first time such incidents have been reported or even made headlines. As China runs numerous infrastructure projects in African regions, the assault and abuse of local employees by the Chinese project managers is highly prevalent, global news agency ANI reported last year. Local workers in Africa are being abused and forcefully made to work under dire conditions, given wages that are way below contract pay. Gabriel Nerona, former advisor on Iran, had informed us via his social media handler on X that this disturbing video of a Chinese boss whipping his African workers got posted in a Chinese language Telegram channel, and the outcome was indeed depressing. On seeing the video, many of the Telegram users had laughed and discussed how Africans and Indians have inferior brains and deserve to be treated like slaves. This information was even more disturbing. According to the news agency ANI, there have been multiple instances of ill treatment of African workers by Chinese project managers. Last year, a Tanzanian woman named Lucy Paulo, who worked as a cook in Standard Gauge Railway, SGR, in the Mwanza region, suffered serious injuries after being assaulted by a Chinese national named Zheng Yuanfen. The Chinese national was arrested and detained at the railway police station initially. He was later moved to Misungwi District Police Station. In 2022, a China-run gold mining company in Zimbabwe was accused of ill-treating workers. The workers were not given decent meals or accommodation while on duty. They were also not given protective gear, exposing them to hazardous chemicals in the factory. Rwanda, in that same year 2022, charged a Chinese businessman, Xu Shungun, with torture and sentenced him to 20 years in prison after he was filmed beating a local worker whom he had tied to a pole. Xu Shunjun was seen yelling at the Rwandan national and whipping him with a lash while other men in orange jackets watched. This breakout angered a lot of Africans in the know. Following the outcome, the Chinese embassy in the Rwandan capital of Kigali warned its citizens in Rwanda to abide by local laws. In 2021, a year before the incident, a Kenyan worker was awarded more than $25,000 by a court after his Chinese employer severely beat him. The Kenyan court found that the man had suffered extreme abuse. This is not limited to African workers only. Earlier this year, South Korea's intelligence agency and researchers reported that at least 3,000 North Korean workers staged protests last month due to exploitative working conditions that have led to incidents and accidents. Large-scale protests by North Koreans are virtually unheard of as China exercises near complete control over the citizens with harsh penalties for dissent. But we shall not go into all that in this video. However, the said footage has sparked a fuming debate around racism and slavery among the netizens, with many of the users expressing their anguish over the vile behavior of the Chinese towards Africans. China is not unique in having a problem with racism. It is a worldwide scourge, and nowhere, it seems, is immune. In every society, there are those who act and believe in highly racist ways, and those who do not at all. China, like most places, is full of both types. What makes the issue different in China is how easy it is to encounter racist behavior and beliefs. It can be strongly argued that this is not because the Chinese as a people are any more or less racist than any other nationality. Quite simply, racist sentiment may seem prevalent simply because it is so blatantly and matter-of-factly expressed when and where it does exist. Foreigners who have spent any length of time in China will have their own stories of racial profiling and discrimination, from very commonly heard comments on the size and shape of facial features to more aggressive forms of discrimination founded on negative stereotypes associated with one's race. And where racism is found in China, there can be little argument that no group is more racially targeted and maligned than persons of sub-Saharan African descent. To understand the anti-blackness in Asian American communities, we need to begin by looking at the historical role played by white supremacy in its creation. One of the earliest cases of pitting Asian Americans against African Americans was during the post-Civil War era, when Southern plantation owners replaced former slaves with Chinese laborers in an attempt to create competition. Plantation owners argued that the Chinese laborers were docile, submissive, and hard-working, unlike African Americans. Moon Ho Jung, associate professor of history at the University of Washington, explains that this hardly reflected the reality of what was happening, but nevertheless, the rhetoric was pushed at the expense of two minority groups and for the benefit of exploitative white plantation owners. However, while America has made significant strides in dismantling legal segregation and promoting racial equality, the scars of its past and the persistence of systemic biases continue to cast a long shadow, but one could say that it's a work in progress. On the other hand, although China and other Asian countries also face their own challenges with racial bias and discrimination, there is obviously not the least effort endeavored towards equality. Scholars have suggested that the People's Republic of China largely portrays racism as a Western phenomenon, which has led to a lack of acknowledgement of racism in its own society. You know what that means, don't you? So, when Chinese workers at a McDonald's in Guangzhou a few years ago held up a sign saying, in English, "Black people are not allowed to enter the restaurant," and they appeared to be completely unembarrassed about the whole thing, that shouldn't surprise you. It is some culture, a norm to spite blacks without thinking it an offensive thing to do. There is the video documentation of the all-out assault on Africans living in Guangzhou, and stories of Chinese police rounding up Africans, forcing them out of their homes and hotels, and putting them out on the street in a backlash against those thought most likely to be carriers and transmitters of the coronavirus. Local authorities were unconcerned with potential accusations of racism, and concern only came at a national level once embassies, leaders and citizens from dozens of African countries began vociferously protesting China's treatment of their citizens. Many Africans have had their own experiences with racism in China. Anecdotes abound. An elevator in the five-star Kempinski Hotel in Beijing, full of guests including a tall black man, stops on a floor on its way down to the lobby. The doors open, and a Chinese woman waiting to get on takes one look at the African man, opens her mouth in shock, and shoos the lift to carry on without her. The African could only laugh. A program connecting Chinese high school students to American faith-based schools and the families that will host them draws hundreds of potential applicants. A majority of applicants request that their child not be sent to live with a black family. Their applications are denied because placing their student with a non-black family would have seemed to have granted their request. A group of ministry-level Chinese officials meets with senior diplomats from an East African country, discussing an infrastructure project that the Chinese side wants to secure the rights to build. Forgetting that the African translator at the table could understand him perfectly, one of the Chinese officials turns to his Chinese colleague and uses an obscenely racist slur in reference to the African diplomat. The interpreter had translated this, but the African diplomat did not flinch nor feel any form of inferiority. Instead of just getting up and walking out, the man had looked his Chinese counterpart straight in the eyes and said, "Tell him I return the compliment, and now let's get down to business." The UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination reported in 2018 that Chinese law does not define racial discrimination and lacks an anti-racial discrimination law in line with the Paris Principles. There are a wealth of papers, articles, books, and commentary tracing Chinese racism from the 1960s to the 1990s. Discrimination against African students has occurred since the arrival of Africans to Chinese universities in the 1960s. In one of the most notable incidents, in late 1988, Chinese students in Nanjing assaulted foreign, mainly African students. The incident had sparked a wave of coverage in foreign media with lots of headlines to go with. One of the earliest works in post-1949 China to document Chinese racism toward Africans was Emmanuel Heavy's An African Student in China, published in London in 1963. In it, Heavy documents his experience of the arrests of Chinese girls for their friendships with Africans, and particularly Chinese feelings of racial superiority over black Africans. In 2007, police anti-drug crackdowns in Beijing's Sanlitun district were reported to target people from Africa as suspected criminals, though police officials denied targeting any specific racial or ethnic group. According to Foreign Policy, African students have reportedly been subjected to more frequent drug testing than students from other regions. Accordingly, some Chinese vloggers have attempted to change the negative stereotypes in their country regarding Africa, while black expats residing in China have reported a mixture of positive and negative experiences. Reports of racism against Africans in China grew during the COVID-19 pandemic in mainland China. In August 2023, Human Rights Watch reported that racist content against black people is widespread on the internet in China. Human Rights Watch found that racist content targeting black people is becoming increasingly prevalent on China's social media platforms, where it is being used to attract traffic and generate profit. Not long ago, there was the news of one Lu K who was sentenced and deported from Malawi for recruiting black children for racial exploitation. Lu K was known to record hundreds of videos every day which he would sell to a Chinese website for up to $70 each. The children in the films were paid around $50 each only. Lu K would make the children chant racist slogans about themselves in Chinese, a language they did not understand. By doing so with the phrases taught, they praised Chinese people, made fun of black poverty, and chanted racist epithets saying, "I am a black monster with a low IQ." This is the product Lu K sold on the internet before he was apprehended by the law, and his fellow Chinese were more than delighted to have been patronizing him all along. Why this madness is so organically irrepressible, one can't seem to start to understand. The rights group reviewed hundreds of videos and posts from 2021 on platforms including Weibo, a short messaging app, and Douyin, the Chinese TikTok, and said it found that content often portrayed black people through offensive racial stereotypes. Such material was also found on the video sharing platform Bilibili, livestream and video app Kuaishou, and social media and e-commerce site Xiaohongshu, it said, noting that the companies had failed to deal with it. The amount and extremity of racist content on the Chinese internet suggests that the platforms either are not meeting their own standards banning racist content, or that their policies are inadequate when addressing racist content, both contrary to their human rights responsibilities, the report said. Human Rights Watch noted that influencer videos depicting black Africans as primitive or dependent on Chinese people as their saviors were particularly widely shared, while black people who married Chinese were accused in online posts of contaminating and threatening the Chinese race. Chinese in relationships with black people, meanwhile, were accused of being traitors. The Chinese government likes to tout China-Africa anti-colonial solidarity and unity, but at the same time ignores pervasive hate speech against black people on the Chinese internet. Yaqiu Wang, senior China researcher at Human Rights Watch, said in a statement, "Beijing should recognize that undertaking investments in Africa and embracing China-Africa friendship won't undo harm caused by unaddressed racism. Many who have watched China's unprecedented commercial and investment entry into Africa have wondered when the long history of Chinese racism toward Africans would again overshadow Beijing's preferred narrative. The COVID-19 pandemic has proved the perfect setting for the resurgence of this ugly phenomenon. Racism against Africans had as well very much played out during the pandemic, when some were forced out of their apartments and singled out for quarantine, prompting rare criticism from African leaders. The COVID outbreak in China, only not long ago, brought about the devastation of a vast population of blacks. Lewis was at the hospital where he interned when he saw videos on social media of a black man being chased in the street by the police. When the 23-year-old medical student from Sierra Leone checked his phone, he had missed calls and messages from friends in the southern Chinese city of Guangzhou who had also seen the video. And there was a notice online in Chinese saying that Africans were importing the virus and needed to be quarantined. Local authorities would come to the hospital where Lewis, who asked that his name be changed for fear of reprisals, worked and told him he needed to quarantine too. They showed him a government notice that said if he had returned to China that day, had been in contact with anyone infected with the virus, or had COVID-19 symptoms, he would have to undergo quarantine, Lewis had told Al Jazeera. He had not been to Wuhan, believed to be the origin of the new coronavirus which causes COVID-19, and had not left Guangzhou since the outbreak had started months before. In fact, he had spent most of his time in the hospital or in his room, a 5-minute walk away. Lewis, who has been in China for 4 years and speaks the language, argued back and forth with the officials for nearly 2 hours. He was part of the medical staff and had been working in a hospital with Chinese doctors since the outbreak began, he told them. He would agree to be tested for the virus, but if he was going to be put under quarantine, his Chinese colleagues would have to go with him. When officials continued to insist, Lewis had refused, asking,
"Is it just because I'm African? Then I won't be quarantined."
Being singled out for quarantine is an experience shared by other African residents of Guangzhou who have been subject to COVID-19 tests and quarantine based on their race. The fallout was swift. Photos circulated on social media showing signs on an apartment building banning black people from entry, and a video of a sign in a local McDonald's doing the same. Africans were evicted from their apartments, and some were forced to sleep on the streets. The response prompted a rare outcry from African leaders who demanded answers from Beijing about the treatment of their citizens in Guangzhou. China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian responded by saying China treats all foreign nationals equally and that the Chinese government has zero tolerance for racism. But these were in words alone. Guangzhou's containment policies highlight underlying social friction between Africans and Chinese that is not usually addressed. Guangzhou is home to the largest population of Africans in China and is one of the biggest travel hubs in the country for traders and African businessmen. However, a lack of communication between local leadership and migrant communities, as well as unresolved visa issues for African nationals, have created the conditions for conflict. Policies to stamp out the virus do little to eradicate animosity and xenophobia towards Africans that became evident in the social media response to events in Guangzhou. People reacted to a report of a Nigerian man attacking a Chinese nurse with calls for Africans to be deported, and described relationships between black people and Chinese as impure. Weibo, a Chinese social media platform, suspended 180 accounts for inciting discrimination. When health policies that are supposed to protect residents exacerbate racial differences, it hurts, Lewis said. He has had patients at the hospital ask for Chinese doctors to treat them instead of him, and he chooses to spend time in places that appear more friendly to foreigners. And reconciliation efforts between governments will have done little when people feel on such a personal level that bridges have been burned. "I will never come back to China when I'm through with my studies, never," Lewis has said. Some African residents said they had been the target of everyday racism and xenophobia long before the COVID pandemic, with state media and adverts deploying blackface and racial caricatures. Human Rights Watch noted most Chinese social media platforms have community standards and guidelines that ban content promoting racial or ethnic hatred and discrimination. It said Bilibili, Kuaishou, Weibo and Xiaohongshu did not respond to its letters questioning the racist content, and urged the platforms, which quickly remove content critical of the government, to take down videos and posts that violate community standards on hate speech or might incite racial discrimination or violence. ByteDance, Douyin's owner, removed one video after it was flagged by Human Rights Watch, but took no action against a number of others concerning a black child, stating that the depiction was not necessarily associated with any certain group or race. Douyin added that it had a combination of people and technology to enforce content moderation guidelines, and that it, on average, takes to action on more than 300 videos and comments per day that include violative content targeting black people. Human Rights Watch said Chinese in interracial relationships with black people were often the target of online abuse, with women being threatened with rape, death and doxing, publishing personally identifiable information without the individual's consent. It noted the prevalence of posts calling on the government to ban black people from becoming permanent residents in China or from marrying Chinese people. Some also adopted racist symbols and language frequently used in the United States in their online posts, while some called for them to be killed. Chinese who condemned the racism or provided support to victims of racism were also targeted, it added. Noting that Beijing maintains one of the world's most sophisticated internet censorship regimes through the so-called Great Firewall, it urged the government to do more to tackle the problem and take steps to promote tolerance and fight prejudice. Major Chinese social media platforms are failing to fulfill their own guidelines to address pervasive racist content, Wang said. Chinese authorities should stop facilitating this toxic environment. In closing, Nicholas Trang, a geek working at an IT automation company in China, shares his story with us.
Like everywhere in the world, I was born in France of Asian descent. I was called a thief in a shop once because I put my hand in my pocket, and the owner thought I stole something. I was called by many names in the streets of southern France just because of my color. It was in the 90s. I was young. Now I live in Shanghai. When I arrived in the year 2003, I would walk with my friends, and Chinese people would talk to me like I was their translator or boy. At a restaurant, they will be polite with them and rude with me. When I learned Chinese in Beijing, I made friends with a black guy from Benin, bilingual in French and Chinese. On this certain day, he nicely came with me to buy a bike. The sales guy kept answering to me when all the words came out of my friend's mouth. He wouldn't accept or couldn't accept that a black guy could talk Chinese, and a Chinese guy could not. Most of my friends are married to Chinese wives. It's common to hear insults from Chinese men. Usually the girls receive the worst insults: whore, materialistic bitch, and all the worst kind of words you can imagine. A friend of mine got beaten up in the subway by 4 jealous Chinese guys, just because he was with his beautiful Chinese girlfriend, and they couldn't bear it. Once, I had read this story in the China Daily, who related an article from a local press. In Guangzhou, a car accident happened, and one black guy came to the rescue of the people still stuck inside the car. He pulled them out before the car took fire, and he left just like that. We are looking for this black guy because we want to decorate him, to show our community that black guys can be nice people. I think this was in 2010. I'm married now to a Chinese wife who doesn't speak English. When we go to Hong Kong now and we speak Chinese, anywhere we go we don't feel welcome, either at the restaurant, the hotel, or any social place one can hang out. So my wife asked me to only speak in French and English, and boy, how nice they are to us. This happens in Taiwan, it happens in Japan, it happens in France, in Italy, in Spain, in the US. Racism has no nationality.
And this brings us to the end of yet another interesting video segment. And if you have learned something, kindly support our work by hitting that like button before you. Share with your friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and kindly subscribe to keep getting notified for more, whilst you also help in building the rising membership of this channel. We are delighted to have you always with us. Thank you for watching.